They say memory fades like ice in the sun, but on the St. Lawrence, the ice never really leaves, and neither do the memories. This river remembers everything, even the things we've tried to forget. The St. Lawrence River doesn't beg for attention. It doesn't whine with tropical flourish, nor roar through steep canyons. But make no mistake, it has carved more history than most rivers dare carry. Stretching over 900 miles from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean, the St. Lawrence is more than just water. It's a corridor, a passageway through time, power, survival, and reinvention. The river divides two nations, Canada and the United States. But more importantly, it connects them, not just through trade and treaties, but through a shared history buried beneath docks, shipyards, and salt-blasted lighthouses. Before any empire mapped it, the St. Lawrence already had a name. To the Haudenosaunee and Algonquin peoples, it was a lifeline, an artery of salmon, sturgeon, and spirit. They read its currents like scripture. They camped where its tides turned. They passed down songs that followed its bends. But everything changed in the 16th century when Jacques Cartier arrived and misnamed it the St. Lawrence, after a Christian martyr who died in fire. It was a strange name for a river of ice, but it stuck. Soon after, the St. Lawrence became the spine of the fur trade, the pulse of a new economy driven by beaver pelts, guns, and gold dreams. French forts sprouted on its banks, English warships sailed through its channels, and indigenous nations were slowly pushed inland, their memory absorbed into a river that remembers everything. It was here, in 1759, during the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, that the British seized control of Quebec City, and with it, control of the St. Lawrence. That one victory rewrote the entire continent. What followed was an industrial century. Steamships, canals, concrete. The river turned from a wild highway into an engineered artery. Locks and dams were carved into its flesh. Its seasonal moods, ice, thaw, flood, were subdued, regulated. And in 1959, when the St. Lawrence Seaway officially opened, this river was no longer just a symbol. It became a machine. Steel floated on its back, grain traveled east, oil moved west, and with every freighter that passed, the river traded one memory for another. Small towns disappeared beneath the rising reservoir. Thousands of people were relocated in silence. The old was sacrificed for the industrial future. And yet, the river didn't forget. On foggy mornings, fishermen still say they hear church bells beneath the water from drowned towns like Mille Roches and Moulinet, places that no longer exist on maps, but live on in the current. There's a strange contradiction to the St. Lawrence. It flows forward but looks backward. Even today, you can stand in Montreal's old port and feel 400 years of memory in the air. The wooden beams of old warehouses still smell of salt and fur. The stones whisper in French and English, sometimes in silence. And then there's the ice. In winter, the St. Lawrence doesn't stop, but it slows. The freighters crawl. The ferries hum against frozen sheets, and the fog wraps everything in quiet. It's a river that forces you to wait. And in that waiting, you feel it. Something old, something heavy. Not nostalgia, but presence. The St. Lawrence has always flowed on its own terms, until we decided to tame it. And in many ways, we did. The construction of the St. Lawrence Seaway was one of the greatest engineering feats of the 20th century. It connected the industrial heart of North America to the Atlantic. It created jobs. It turned cities like Toronto, Montreal, and Detroit into global ports. But what came with it was silence. Not the quiet of peace, but the kind of silence that follows displacement. A silencing of landscapes, of communities, of ecosystems. Entire towns were drowned to make room for the Seaway. 19 villages, over 500 people, forced to leave everything behind: houses, schools, cemeteries. What remains of them now lies underwater, their roads traced only by divers, their names kept alive only in memory. And just like that progress moved forward, and the past was submerged. Today, over 40 million tons of cargo travel the St. Lawrence every year. Iron ore, grain, oil, steel, the lifeblood of modern life, flowing on the back of this old river. The locks, dams, and canals work like arteries and valves. They don't just carry freight, they regulate the river's speed, pressure, even its heartbeat. But with every intervention, we also make the river more fragile. Because ice doesn't care about engineering. It arrives early, or late, or thicker than last year, and it's getting harder to predict. For those who live along the river, winter isn't just a season, it's a negotiation. The ice doesn't just freeze the surface, it cracks foundations. It seizes docks. It pulls buoys under, drags boats from their moorings. And when it breaks, it doesn't break quietly. There's a sound if you've heard it once. You never forget a groaning roar, like the earth exhaling through clenched teeth. Every spring, the river lets go, and every year, the damage worsens. Climate change hasn't skipped the St. Lawrence. Winters are less predictable. Freeze-thaw cycles are more violent, and what was once seasonal rhythm has become chaotic noise. Shipping is harder. Fisheries are declining, and communities that have lived in sync with the river for generations are now bracing for its unpredictability. The same river that once built economies is now threatening them. The St. Lawrence has always been powerful, says an old dock worker from Trois-Rivières, but now it feels angry. Like it doesn't recognize us anymore. And maybe it doesn't. Maybe the river sees us as we really are strangers standing on borrowed ground, chasing speed on a waterway that was never meant to be rushed. The St. Lawrence isn't just a river. It's a story, etched into stone, whispered in snow, hidden in rust. Some stories are told through lighthouses standing alone in the mist, their lights still blinking for ships that no longer pass. Others are told through the ruins of canals, the bones of shipwrecks, the ghost rails of cargo lines long shut down. And some stories live only in the people and fishermen who've worked the same bends of the river for decades, in elders who speak of towns that no longer exist, in artists who paint the light off the ice just before thaw. There is grief here, but it's not loud. It's patient, like the St. Lawrence itself. It doesn't beg to be remembered. It just waits for someone to notice. This river is a contradiction. It is movement and stillness, steel and silence, progress and pause. Ships glide past industrial docks lined with grain elevators, then, just a few miles later, pass a monastery that stood since 1671. Factories blink and hum, then vanish behind pine trees and frozen banks. There are days when the water reflects smokestacks, and others when it mirrors only sky. And in this contrast, this delicate balance between what we've built and what we've forgotten, the St. Lawrence becomes something more than geography. It becomes a mirror of how we've changed, a mirror of what we've chosen to remember and what we've chosen to drown. We've called this river many names: a trade route, a border, a channel, a seaway. But maybe we need to call it something else now: a witness. Because the St. Lawrence has seen everything. It watched the fur trade rise and collapse. It carried warships and peace treaties. It fed empires and drowned villages. It bore our steel and our stories. And now it watches us as we face rising temperatures, aging infrastructure, and a future we're not ready for. There's a quote by Canadian poet Al Purdy that goes, "A man might spend his whole life listening to the river and never hear the same thing twice." I think that's true of the St. Lawrence. Sometimes when it speaks of industry, of cranes and cargo, of numbers and growth. Other times, it speaks in memories and bells under the water, in sunken roads, in frozen sighs. And sometimes, if you're quiet enough, it speaks only in presence. It says, "I am here. I remember. Will you?" We're so used to racing forward, we forget to listen. But the St. Lawrence never forgets. And in a time when the world feels like it's cracking beneath pressure, beneath speed, beneath loss, maybe we need rivers like this to show us how to carry it all without collapsing. If this story stirred something in you, don't let it stop here. Share this video. Leave a comment with your own memory of a river, a place, a silence that meant something. And if you believe that rivers aren't just water, but living memories, subscribe to this channel. Because the St. Lawrence still has stories to tell, and we are only just beginning to listen.